Jessamine felt the dust of 3 states in her throat, a grit that had settled deep in her bones and seemed unlikely to ever leave. The town of Redemption, Montana, did not look like redemption. It looked like more dust, held together by splintering clapboard and the weary hopes of men who had forgotten what green looked like. Her husband, Thomas, had believed in this place. He had spoken of it as a promised land, a place to build a life from the good, clean dirt. But Thomas had been taken by a fever 100 miles back, leaving her with a broken-down wagon, 2 worn-out mules, and a heart so hollow it felt like the wind whistled through it. She sold the mules for a pittance, enough for a week's board if she was lucky. The wagon, their last shared home, went for less. The man at the mercantile, a stout fellow with a greasy apron, counted out the coins into her palm as if he were doing her a grand favor. His eyes lingered on her, not with pity, but with a kind of dismissive appraisal that was somehow worse. She was another widow, another piece of flotsam washed up on the shores of the frontier, a problem to be solved or ignored. "Any work?" she asked, her voice raspy. "I can cook, clean, mend. I'm a hard worker." The man just grunted, turning to another customer. A few men loitering by the Cracker Barrel snickered. They were rough-looking, smelling of horse and sweat, and their amusement felt like tiny, sharp stones thrown at her. She clutched the coins in her hand, the metal cool against her skin, and forced herself to stand taller. She had not come this far to crumble in a general store. "Nate Blackwood's looking for a cook," one of the men offered, a younger one with a slightly kinder face. "Housekeeper up and ran off last week, said the place was haunted by more than just memories." He winked, but the joke fell flat. "Blackwood Ranch?" she asked, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. "Biggest spread in the territory," the mercantile owner said, finally looking at her again. "But Nate, he ain't an easy man. Not since his wife passed." He shook his head. "It's 5 miles north of town. You'd have to walk." The unspoken challenge hung in the air. A woman, alone, walking 5 miles into the wilderness to beg for a job from a notoriously difficult man. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her to falter, to admit defeat. She gave a single sharp nod, turned, and walked out of the store, the bell above the door jangling a tinny, mocking farewell. The walk was a pilgrimage of dust and sun. The road was little more than 2 ruts carved into the prairie, and the vast empty sky pressed down on her, making her feel small and utterly alone. She thought of Thomas, of his easy smile and the way he had held her hand as they planned their future. Grief was a physical weight, a stone she carried in her chest. But beneath the grief, a harder, more stubborn thing was beginning to form. It was the will to simply survive. By the time she saw the entrance to the Blackwood Ranch, a simple arch of peeled logs with BR burned into the crossbeam, her feet were blistered, and her thin dress was soaked with sweat. The ranch was enormous, a small town unto itself. A sprawling main house stood on a low rise, flanked by barns, corrals, and a dozen smaller outbuildings. Men on horseback moved with lazy purpose, and the air was thick with the sounds and smells of a working cattle operation. The lowing of calves, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rich scent of hay and manure. She approached the main house, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The porch was wide and shaded, and a man stood there staring out at the distant mountains. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark, practical clothes that were clean but well-worn. His back was to her, but there was an authority in his stillness, a sense of coiled power that made the air around him seem heavier. This had to be Nate Blackwood. She cleared her throat. "Excuse me, Mr. Blackwood?" He turned slowly. His face was hard, carved from the same unforgiving landscape he commanded. Sharp cheekbones, a square jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes the color of a winter sky. They were cold, assessing, and held a deep, settled sadness that he seemed to wear like a second skin. He looked her over, from her dusty, broken boots to her sun-beaten face, and his expression did not soften. "I heard you might be in need of a cook," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "My name is Jessamine. I'm a hard worker. I can start immediately." His gaze was so intense it felt as if he were seeing right through her, tallying up her losses and finding her wanting. "The town sent you?" His voice was a low rumble laced with impatience. "No one sent me. I came on my own." A man came striding up from the direction of the largest barn. He was wiry and had a mean, pinched face. "Boss, that black devil nearly took my head off again." He stopped when he saw Jessamine, a sneer automatically forming on his lips. "Well, look what the dust blew in." Nate Blackwood ignored him, his cold eyes still fixed on Jessamine. "I don't have time for strays. The last woman couldn't handle the isolation. You don't look any tougher than she was." It was a dismissal, blunt and brutal. The foreman, who she now guessed was named Jed, laughed. "She looks like she'd break in a strong wind, boss." Something inside Jessamine snapped. The grief, the fear, the humiliation of the past few days coalesced into a single point of pure, cold anger. "I have buried a husband, sold everything I owned, and walked 5 miles in this heat because I am not a stray to be shooed away," she said, her voice low and trembling with a force that surprised even herself. "I am a woman who needs a job. If you want someone who can handle isolation and isn't afraid of ghosts, you're looking at her. I don't scare easy, Mr. Blackwood, and I make a damn fine stew." Silence descended on the porch. The foreman looked shocked into speechlessness. Nate Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of something. It wasn't kindness, not yet. It was surprise. He had expected her to cry or run. She had done neither. He gave a curt nod. "The kitchen's through there. The cook's cabin is out back. You'll get meals and $1 a week. Jed will show you. You start now. Supper is in 3 hours for 20 men." He turned and walked back into the house without another word, leaving her standing on the porch with the sneering foreman. Jed spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "Don't get comfortable. He'll chew you up and spit you out before the week is done." As Jed led her toward the back of the house, her gaze was drawn to a far corral, built of thick, reinforced logs. Inside it, a horse paced, a creature of midnight and fury. It was a stallion, pure black, with a wildness in its eyes that seemed to burn. Its coat was scarred, its mane a tangled mess, but it moved with a terrible, captive grace. The raw, untamed power of the animal was breathtaking. "What horse is that?" she asked, unable to look away. Jed snorted. "That's Midnight, the devil himself. Threw the boss, broke 2 hands' arms. Worth a fortune, but no man can get near him. He'd kill you as soon as look at you." He gave her a pointed look. "Some things are just too broken to be tamed. The boss says to stay clear of that corral. He means it." Jessamine nodded, but her eyes stayed on the black stallion. She didn't see a devil. She saw terror. She saw pain. She saw a creature trapped by a world it didn't understand, lashing out from a place of deep and profound fear. In the wild, magnificent beast, she saw a reflection of her own caged and grieving heart. The kitchen was large but neglected, coated in a fine layer of grime. The last housekeeper had clearly left in a hurry. Without a word, Jessamine tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, found a bucket, and started scrubbing. She worked with a silent, focused fury, channeling her grief and uncertainty into the simple, honest labor. She found the pantry, blessedly well stocked, and began planning the meal. Potatoes, onions, a side of beef from the smokehouse, a simple, hearty stew, bread to be baked, coffee to be brewed, strong and hot. The ranch hands filed in for supper that evening, noisy and boisterous. They eyed her with curiosity and suspicion, Jed at their head, his arms crossed as if waiting for a disaster. They ate in silence at first, then the silence was broken by the scrape of spoons against bowls, and then by appreciative grunts. The stew was rich and flavorful. The bread was fresh and warm. It was the best meal they had eaten in weeks. Nate Blackwood did not eat with his men. A plate was taken to his study by a young boy who worked in the house. Jessamine wondered what he thought of the food, or if he even noticed. After the men had left, she cleaned the mountain of dishes, her body aching with a fatigue so deep it was almost a comfort. It was a clean, earned exhaustion, different from the soul weariness of grief. Her cabin was small and sparse, but it was clean. There was a narrow bed, a small table, and a window that looked out over the vast, dark prairie. Before she fell into a dreamless sleep, she looked out that window toward the far corral. She could just make out the dark shape of the stallion, standing motionless under the moon, a lonely silhouette against the endless sky. The days settled into a rhythm. Jessamine rose before dawn, her first task to light the massive stove in the main house kitchen. She baked biscuits, fried bacon, and put on a cauldron of coffee that could float a horseshoe. The men, who had initially been wary, started to thaw. A quiet, "Mornin', ma'am," replaced the smirks. A tip of the hat. One of the older hands, a man named Silas with kind, crinkled eyes, started leaving a small pile of kindling by her cabin door each morning. Jed remained hostile. He watched her with narrowed eyes, looking for any mistake, any sign of weakness. He made snide comments just loud enough for her to hear, about women not belonging on a man's ranch, about her cooking being a temporary fluke. Jessamine ignored him. She had learned on the trail that some obstacles were best navigated by pretending they weren't there. Nate Blackwood remained a ghost. He was a presence, a shadow at the edge of her days. She would see him riding out at dawn, a solitary figure against the rising sun. She would hear his heavy boots on the floorboards of the study above the kitchen late at night. They rarely spoke. He would occasionally appear in the kitchen doorway to issue a clipped order or ask a question, his voice always impersonal, his eyes always looking through her, or past her, at some private sorrow. But he noticed things. One afternoon, she was struggling to haul a heavy sack of flour. He appeared from nowhere, lifted the sack as if it were a pillow, and set it on the counter. He just said, "Watch your back," and was gone before she could thank him. The brief scent of leather and pine he left in his wake lingered in the air, unsettling her more than the weight of the flour ever could have. Her free time, what little she had, was spent near Midnight's corral. She would bring him an apple from the kitchen or a handful of sweet grass she'd pulled from the riverbank. At first, he would snort and rear, charging the fence with teeth bared. She never flinched. She would simply stand there, just outside the range of his fury, and speak to him in a low, calm voice. She told him about the prairies in Illinois, about the way the wind sounded in the tall grass. She told him about Thomas, about his gentle hands and his belief in a better life. She poured her own loneliness and grief into the space between them, and the wild horse, in his own tormented solitude, seemed to listen. Slowly, ever so slowly, the frenzied charges stopped. He would still watch her with suspicion, his black eyes rolling, but he would stand at the far side of the corral and listen, his ears twitching to the rhythm of her voice. One afternoon, the men were trying to break him again. It was a brutal, ugly spectacle. A young, cocky hand managed to get a saddle on him, but the moment he swung into the seat, Midnight exploded. The horse didn't just buck. He twisted and spun with a vicious intelligence, a whirlwind of black muscle and rage. The rider was thrown hard against the fence, landing with a sickening crack. Jed and two other men rushed in to help the downed cowboy, who was groaning and clutching a clearly broken leg. Nate Blackwood vaulted down from the top rail of the main corral, his face a mask of grim fury. But Jessamine's eyes were on the horse. Midnight had retreated to a corner, his sides heaving, his body trembling not with rage, but with sheer heart-stopping terror. His eyes were wide, showing the whites, and a trickle of blood ran from his mouth where the bit had torn him. While the men were focused on their injured comrade, Jessamine slipped through the gate of the reinforced corral. A collective shout went up. "Get out of there, woman!" Jed roared. Nate's head snapped up. "Jessamine, get back!" His voice was a whip crack of command. She ignored them all. She walked slowly, calmly toward the terrified animal. She held her hands out, palms open, showing she was empty-handed. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice the same low croon she used when she spoke to him from outside the fence. "Easy, boy. No one is going to hurt you anymore." Midnight snorted, his head high, his muscles bunched to charge. He watched her, a wild thing deciding between fight and flight. The men stood frozen, expecting to see her trampled. Nate had started to climb the fence, his face pale, ready to intervene. Jessamine kept walking, kept murmuring. She didn't look him in the eye. A gesture she knew from her father's farm was a challenge. She looked at his shoulder, at the ground. She was submission. She was safety. "You're just scared," she whispered. "I know. I'm scared too. But we don't have to be." She was 5 feet away. 3 feet. Close enough to smell the sweat and fear coming off him in waves. He stamped a hoof, a final warning. She stopped and simply stood, breathing slowly, rhythmically. She held out her hand. After a long, tense moment that stretched into eternity, the great black horse lowered his head. He took a hesitant step forward, and another. Then, gently, tentatively, he touched her outstretched palm with his velvet nose. A collective gasp went through the watching men. Jessamine didn't move. She simply let him feel the warmth of her skin, the steadiness of her hand. Then, with infinite slowness, she lifted her other hand and stroked his powerful neck, right behind the ear. He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into her touch, a long, shuddering sigh escaping his lungs. She stood there for a long time, stroking the magnificent, broken creature, murmuring words of comfort only he could hear. The entire ranch was silent, watching this impossible scene. When she finally turned, she looked directly at Nate Blackwood. His face was a storm of conflicting emotions: shock, disbelief, and something else she couldn't name. It looked almost like hope. "He's not broken," she said, her voice clear and caring in the sudden stillness. "He's just been hurt." From that day on, everything changed. Nate gave her quiet permission to work with Midnight. "Be careful," was all he said, but his eyes held a new respect. Jed was furious, his resentment now mixed with a grudging fear of her uncanny ability. He muttered to the other hands, "It's unnatural. Witchcraft." But the other men saw it differently. They had seen her courage, her calm. They had seen the miracle in the corral. The quiet "Mornin', ma'am" was now often accompanied by a small smile. Silas started bringing her wildflowers along with the kindling. The ranch had found its new legend, and it was the quiet cook who could soothe the devil horse. Jessamine spent every spare moment she could find with Midnight. She never tried to put a saddle on him. She simply groomed him, talked to him, and led him on a rope around the corral. She was teaching him that human hands could be gentle, that a human voice could be kind. And as she worked to heal the horse's trust, she felt the broken pieces of her own heart slowly begin to mend. Nate watched her. She would catch glimpses of him, standing on the porch, in the doorway of the barn, or looking out his study window. He never approached, never interfered. He was just a constant, silent observer. His presence was a heavy weight in the air, a question she didn't know how to answer. Why did the opinion of this cold, grieving man matter so much to her? One evening, she was scrubbing the great kitchen table long after the men had gone, her arms aching. The house was silent except for the chirp of crickets outside. The door to the study opened and Nate came in, holding an empty coffee cup. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper in the lantern light. "You work too late," he said. It wasn't an order, just a statement. "There's always something to be done," she replied, not looking up from her work. Her hands were raw and chapped from the harsh lye soap. He stood there for a moment, watching the rhythmic motion of her arm. "My wife, Eleanor," he said, his voice suddenly rough. She used to say that. She could make this whole house shine. Jessamine stopped scrubbing. It was the first time he had ever mentioned his wife to her. She looked up and met his gaze. The winter in his eyes had receded, just for a moment, revealing a vast, desolate landscape of pain. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly. He just nodded, his throat working. He set his cup on the counter and left as silently as he had come. The next morning, when she entered the kitchen, a small, unmarked tin sat on the windowsill. She opened it. It was a balm of lanolin and herbs, the kind that soothed chapped skin. There was no note, but she knew. Her heart gave a strange, unexpected flutter. She rubbed a little of the cool balm into her hands, the gesture feeling more intimate than a touch. The slow burn of their connection was built in these small, unspoken moments. A cold snap hit the plains, bringing a wind that cut like a knife. As Jessamine hurried from the main house to her cabin, huddled in her thin shawl, he stepped off the porch and intercepted her. Without a word, he took off his own heavy sheepskin coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy, warm, and smelled of him, pine, leather, and the clean scent of the cold night air. "You'll catch your death," he muttered, and was gone before she could protest. She stood there, wrapped in his warmth, her heart pounding. She wore the coat back to her cabin and held it close all night, the lingering heat a comfort against the lonely dark. The distance between them was shrinking, but the space was filled with a tension that was both terrifying and thrilling. The breaking point came a week later. She was in the round pen with Midnight. She had finally placed a light blanket on his back, and he had accepted it. She was leading him in a circle, her hand resting on his neck, when a rattlesnake, disturbed from its sunning spot, coiled and hissed near the fence. Midnight, his old terror triggered, reared with a wild scream. Jessamine stumbled backward, losing her footing in the soft dirt, her ankle twisting beneath her. Before she could even hit the ground, a dark shape vaulted over the fence. It was Nate. He landed with a cat-like grace and grabbed her, his strong arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The snake was gone, vanished back into the grass. The horse had calmed, standing a few feet away, his nostrils flared. But Jessamine was aware of nothing but the man holding her. His heart was hammering against her back, or maybe it was her own. His hand was a brand on her waist. She could feel the solid wall of his chest, the strength in his arms. She tilted her head back to look at him. His face was inches from hers. The cold mask was gone, replaced by a raw, naked concern. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her mouth, and the air crackled with everything they hadn't said, everything they hadn't done. The world seemed to stop, shrinking to the space between their two bodies. He was going to kiss her. She knew it. She wanted it with an ache that was sharp and sweet. Then, as if touching a hot stove, he let her go. He took a step back, his expression shuddering again, the cold walls slamming back into place. "You're not hurt?" he asked, his voice strained. "No," she whispered, her body trembling. "I'm fine." He looked at her for another long, unreadable moment, then turned and left the round pen without another word. He didn't just walk away. He fled. And Jessamine understood. He was as terrified of this feeling as she was. The need she saw in his eyes was a mirror of her own, and that shared vulnerability was more dangerous than any wild horse. The invisible thread that had been pulling them together had been stretched taut, and now it had been seen. Jed, the foreman, had seen it. His face, watching from the barn, was twisted with a venomous jealousy. He had seen the way Nate looked at her, the way he had held her, and he decided it was time to cut that thread for good. Jed went to town that Saturday. He didn't just spread rumors, he cultivated them, watering them with whispers of poison and deceit. He told the men at the saloon that the new cook at the Blackwood Ranch had a strange hold on the boss. He hinted to the church-going women at the Mercantile that Jessamine was no grieving widow, but a black-hearted opportunist. "They say her husband died awful sudden on the trail," he'd say, letting the words hang in the air. "And her with not a tear in her eye, just lookin' for the next rich man to latch onto." The town of Redemption, starved for gossip and suspicious of outsiders, devoured it. Mrs. Abernathy, a formidable woman whose daughter Clara had long been considered the most suitable match for the widowed Nate Blackwood, took Jed's poison and refined it. She spoke in hushed, concerned tones about that woman's influence, about the danger to Nate's reputation, to his very soul. Jessamine knew nothing of this until the next time she went to town for supplies. The friendly greetings were gone. The mercantile owner was brusque, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Women pulled their children closer as she passed, their whispers following her like wasps. The kindness of the community, which she had only just begun to feel, had curdled into open hostility. She returned to the ranch with her head held high, but inside, the old hollowness had returned, colder and more jagged than before. The poison seeped back to the ranch. Nate became more distant than ever. The brief warmth that had begun to bloom between them was buried under a new layer of ice. He was curt, his orders clipped. He avoided the kitchen, avoided the round pen, avoided her eyes. She felt him pulling away, and the pain of it was a physical ache. She feared he believed the rumors. She feared he was ashamed of the moment they had shared. She was once again the stray, the outsider, tolerated but not wanted. The final confrontation was inevitable. It was Jed who forced it. He had been drinking, his courage bolstered by whiskey and his own festering resentment. He found Jessamine in the round pen with Midnight. She had progressed to the point where she could lay across the horse's back, the animal standing perfectly still, trusting her weight. Jed staggered to the fence, his face flushed. "Well, ain't that a pretty picture?" he slurred, his voice loud enough to carry. Several of the other hands, drawn by the commotion, stopped their work to watch. "The witch and her demon? Or are you just practicing for the boss's bed?" Jessamine slid off the horse's back, her face pale with rage. "You're drunk, Jed. Go sleep it off." "I ain't going nowhere," he spat. "All this time, this sweet talk and soft touches. It's all a trick. You ain't no horse whisperer. You're a whore, that's what you are." He pointed a shaking finger at her. "If you're so damn good with him, ride him. In front of everyone. Or is it all just a lie, like everything else about you?" The challenge hung in the dusty air. More men were gathering now. And then he appeared. Nate Blackwood strode out from the barn, his face like a thundercloud. He had heard everything. The entire ranch was watching, waiting to see what the boss would do. This was it. The moment of truth. Jessamine looked at Nate, her heart in her throat, pleading with her eyes for him to believe in her, to stand by her. He looked from her to Jed, then to the crowd of silent watching men. His face was unreadable, a mask of cold authority. "Ride him," Nate said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The words hit Jessamine like a physical blow. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't support. It was a command. A test. He was putting her on trial in front of the very men who mocked her. A wave of despair so profound it was nauseating washed over her. He didn't believe her. Or worse, he didn't care if the rumors were true. He just wanted to see the trick performed. But then she looked at Midnight, who had moved to stand beside her, nudging her shoulder with his head as if in comfort. She looked at Jed's triumphant sneer, and she looked back at Nate's cold, shuttered face. Fine. If they wanted a show, she would give them one. She would not let them break her. With a grace born of desperation, she gathered the horse's mane in her hand. She put her foot on a low rail of the fence for a step and swung herself onto Midnight's bare back. She needed no saddle, no bridle. She sat astride the magnificent beast, her back straight, her head held high. The horse tensed under her, sensing the charged atmosphere. For a heart-stopping second she thought he would bolt, that his old terror would reclaim him. She leaned forward, pressing her cheek against his neck, whispering into his ear, her words lost to the wind. "It's just us now. Just you and me. Show them." And he did. Midnight took a step, then another, as calm as a Sunday pony. He walked a slow, deliberate circle around the pen. The men watched in stunned, absolute silence. Jed's jaw had dropped. Then, Jessamine gently squeezed her heels against his sides, a signal they had practiced 100 times. Midnight broke into a smooth, easy trot, then a canter. They moved as one, a seamless union of woman and horse, circling the pen with a fluid, impossible grace. Finally, she urged him into a gallop, and they flew, a blur of black hide and wind-tangled hair, the thunder of his hooves, the only sound in a world that had gone completely still. She brought him to a halt in the center of the pen, his sides barely heaving. He was calm. He was hers. She had done it. She had broken the horse no man could touch. She slid from his back, her legs shaking, and looked up at the faces staring back at her. The mockery was gone, replaced by awe. Nate walked to Jed, his face carved from stone. "You're fired. Get your things and get off my land, now." Jed sputtered, but one look at Nate's eyes sent him scrambling away. A small, fierce knot of triumph bloomed in Jessamine's chest. He had defended her. He had chosen her. But then Nate turned to her, and the triumph died. His face was still a mask, but now it was a mask of business. He pulled a leather pouch from his belt. "That was a remarkable piece of work," he said, his voice cool and transactional. "The horse is finally broken. You've done what I paid you for, and more." He held out the pouch. "Name your price. For the horse. For your trouble." The words were colder than any winter wind. He hadn't seen her. He hadn't seen the trust, the connection, the miracle. He had only seen a service rendered, a job completed. He was trying to pay her for the one thing that wasn't for sale. He was trying to put a price on her heart, and in doing so, he was telling her it had no value beyond what it could do for him. The pain was so sharp, it stole her breath. This was worse than the rumors, worse than the sneers. This was a betrayal from the one person she had allowed herself to hope for. He had seen her soul, and he had offered to buy it like a sack of grain. She looked at the pouch in his hand, then back at his face. She saw no love there, no admiration, only a man trying to settle a debt, to put a wall of money back between them, to make things simple and clean and empty again. "There is no price," she said, her voice a hollow whisper. She turned her back on him, on the stunned men, on the horse that had been her only friend. "I'll be gone by morning." She walked away, each step an agony, leaving him standing alone in the center of the world he had built, a world she now knew she could never be a part of. The connection hadn't just been broken. He had deliberately, brutally, severed it himself. Jessamine didn't cry. The capacity for tears seemed to have been burned out of her. She packed her few meager belongings into a small bundle, her movements stiff and automatic. The coat he had given her, she folded neatly and left on the bed. She would take nothing of his with her. The balm for her hands she left on the windowsill. Let it be a reminder of the brief moment he had almost seen her as a person. She had nowhere to go, no money, no plan. The familiar terror of destitution clawed at her, but it was dull compared to the fresh, gaping wound in her chest. She had been a fool to believe a man like Nate Blackwood could change, a fool to mistake his haunted loneliness for a space she could fill. He was a fortress, and he had just raised the drawbridge, leaving her outside in the cold. Her last act was to go to the corral. Midnight was waiting, his dark head over the fence. He nickered softly as she approached, a sound of greeting and concern. She reached up and stroked his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Goodbye, my friend," she whispered, pressing her forehead against his. "You're safe now. He won't let them hurt you again." The horse nudged her, a warm, solid presence in a world that had dissolved into smoke. A single hot tear escaped her control and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She would not be leaving astray. She was leaving a friend. Meanwhile, Nate stood in his study, the leather pouch still heavy in his hand. He had watched her walk away, her back ramrod straight, and the sight had filled him with a cold dread. He had done what he always did. He had pushed away warmth. He had turned a moment of connection into a transaction. It was safer that way. Money was simple. Feelings were a wilderness he had gotten lost in once before, with Eleanor. He had barely survived. He poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid doing nothing to warm the ice in his gut. He looked at the portrait of his late wife over the mantel. Her smile was gentle, her eyes full of a life he had failed to protect. He had sworn after she died that he would never be that vulnerable again. He had built this ranch, this empire of dust and cattle, as a fortress against feeling, against loss. And then Jessamine had walked into his life, a slip of a woman with the heart of a lioness and eyes that saw the pain in a wild horse. She hadn't just tamed Midnight, she had been slowly, patiently taming him. She had breached his walls not with force, but with quiet competence, with unexpected kindness, with a stew that tasted of home, and it had terrified him. The moment in the round pen, when he had held her, he had felt something he hadn't felt in years. Life. A fierce, terrifying, undeniable spark of it. And his first instinct had been to extinguish it, to retreat to the safety of his grief. His offer of money had been an act of cowardice, a desperate attempt to put her back in a box labeled employee, so he wouldn't have to confront the woman who made his heart beat again. He had saved her from destitution, yes, but she had been saving him from a living death, from the cold, lonely prison of his own making, and he had just thrown her out. He looked at Eleanor's portrait. She had loved his passion, his fire. That fire had turned to ash when she died. Jessamine had been blowing on the embers. Idiot, he said aloud to the empty room. He had a choice. He could let her walk away, let the fortress close back around him, and live out his days in the safe, gray twilight of his own grief. Or he could ride after her. He could choose the terror and uncertainty of feeling again. He slammed the whiskey glass down on the desk, the sound cracking the silence. He strode out of the house, his long legs eating up the ground. He didn't saddle a horse. This was a reckoning that had to be met on his own 2 feet. He found her by Midnight's corral, a small, solitary figure silhouetted against the pre-dawn glow. Her bundle of belongings was at her feet. She was saying her goodbyes. "Jessamine," he said. His voice was raw. She stiffened but didn't turn. "There's nothing left to say, Mr. Blackwood." "You're wrong," he said, walking closer until he was standing just behind her. "There's everything to say." He waited until she finally, reluctantly, turned to face him. Her eyes were shadowed with pain and exhaustion, but they were dry. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice flat. "I know," he said softly. It was a fool's gesture, a coward's gesture. He looked her in the eye, and for the first time he let her see everything. The grief, the fear, the desperate, burgeoning hope. The walls were down. "I was wrong. What you did with that horse, it wasn't a trick. It was a miracle, and I was afraid of it. I was afraid of you." He reached out, not to touch her, but as a plea. "When my wife died, this house became wood and nails. This land became dirt and rock. I've been living in an empty shell for 3 years, Jessamine. And then you came. You filled the silence. You brought warmth back into the corners. You made me feel—" He struggled for the word. "You made me feel alive again, and it terrified me." He took a deep breath, the cold morning air searing his lungs. This was it, the point of no return. "I am asking you to stay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not as my cook, not as a horse trainer." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Just stay. Please. Don't let me be a coward." Her expression was frozen, caught between disbelief and a fragile, dawning hope. She had saved his horse. He had stood up for her against his men. But this was the true rescue. He was pulling her back from the brink of lonely despair, and she, simply by being there, was pulling him from his tomb of grief. "This place is just wood and dirt without the right person in it," he whispered, finally closing the distance between them. He didn't touch her. He just stood close enough for her to feel his warmth. "I've been living in an empty house for a long time." Slowly, as if waking from a long dream, she nodded. A single word, a single gesture. But it changed everything. It was the promise of a new beginning, forged not in fire and passion, but in the quiet, steady truth of mutual need. He had offered her a home, not just a roof, and she, in turn, was offering him a reason to live in it. 6 months later, the autumn sun cast long golden shadows across the ranch. Jessamine sat on the porch swing of the main house, a wool blanket across her lap, a cup of tea warming her hands. Her cabin was now used for storage. The chapped skin on her hands was a distant memory. In the large pasture below the house, Midnight grazed peacefully alongside a dozen other horses. He would always be hers, a special bond no one else could share. But his wildness was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding calm. He was home. The front door opened and Nate came out, carrying a cup of his own. The harsh lines on his face had softened. The winter in his eyes had thawed, replaced by the warm, steady light of a man who had found his way back into the sun. He sat beside her on the swing, his presence comfortable and solid. He didn't speak, just reached over and took her free hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It was a simple, everyday gesture, but it held the weight of 1,000 promises made and kept. The whispers in town had long since died down, silenced by the unshakable reality of Nate Blackwood's devotion. The men on the ranch treated her with a fierce, protective respect. She was no longer the stray, the cook, or the horse witch. She was Jessamine Blackwood. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the mountains, painting the vast sky in shades of orange and purple. The frontier was still wild, the land still unforgiving, but it no longer felt lonely. She looked at the strong, quiet man beside her, the man she had saved from his own ghosts, just as he had saved her from the dust. She had come to redemption seeking survival, and instead, she had found a home.